A Roman magistrate slams his stylus into a wax tablet. That sharp, wet click rings out in the quiet room, reverberating with significance. It's not just a sentence or a simple decision. This is a validation of something much larger, something that will continue to shape the world for centuries to come. He's not looking at a man standing before him as a person, as an individual with rights and dignity. No, he is looking at a man, but what he sees is an object. And with that single motion of the stylus, he affirms an idea that would go on to outlast the mighty Roman Empire, the Caesars, and even the Colosseum. This idea would come to define the very structure of our modern world. That idea was Dominium. This might sound like a dusty old word from history, something you've probably heard a few times, but it's much more than a historical curiosity. In fact, you live inside the architecture of Dominium every single day. It's embedded deep in the systems that govern your life, from the mortgage you pay to the work you do, to the very corporations that control so much of the global economy. Dominium is not just an old concept, it's a force, a hidden system running under the surface of everything, shaping the way the world works. This story starts in ancient Rome, before the days of emperors and grand arenas, back in the early Roman Republic. Back then, ownership was a simpler, less defined thing. It wasn't about possessing something outright in the way we think of it today. It was about use. People had the right to use the land, the tools, and the animals they needed for their daily lives. The community understood these relationships, and there were clear agreements on how things worked. If you had the right to use a field or a plow, it was a shared understanding, not an ironclad legal contract. But as the Roman Republic expanded and evolved, the idea of ownership began to change. By the time the 1st century BCE rolled around, Rome was starting to consume itself from the inside out. The old ideals of the Republic, once focused on equality and civic duty, were beginning to fray. Corruption, war, and the increasing power of military leaders were tearing apart the fabric of Roman society. As the Republic gave way to the Roman Empire, a new legal framework was born, a framework that would forever alter the nature of ownership and power. This new legal idea was Dominium, and it was something entirely different from the old ways of thinking about land and property. Dominium was not just about using something, it was about having absolute, total control over something. And this control was not just limited to physical objects. It extended to human beings as well. The Roman jurists, the legal minds who shaped this new world, defined Dominium with a chilling precision. They broke it down into 3 core powers. The first power was jundi, the right to use property. This was straightforward enough, it simply meant the right to use what you owned. The second power was jouendi, the right to enjoy the fruits of that property, profits, crops, anything of value that came from it. But it was the third power, jus abutendi, that really changed everything. This third right, the right to abuse, the right to destroy, was where things got truly terrifying. Under Dominium, the definition of ownership wasn't complete unless the owner had the right to destroy whatever they owned. This wasn't just about breaking something by accident or letting something fall into disrepair. It was about having the legal right to completely annihilate what you owned, even if what you owned was a person. It's a dark, brutal concept, and it's one that would go on to form the foundation of one of the most destructive systems in history: slavery. Under Dominium, a slave was not considered a person, they were a thing. They were seen as property, something to be used and profited from, but ultimately something that could be destroyed without consequence. The law didn't just permit this, it actively protected it. The right to own, to profit from, and to destroy a slave was enshrined as the sacred right of the owner. This was the moment when a legal fiction, an abstract idea written on a tablet, became more important than the sanctity of human life. The concept of owning something became more sacred than the actual physical reality of being. This legal idea, this concept of Dominium, didn't die with Rome. It didn't fade away with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. Instead, it lay dormant for centuries, buried under the layers of feudalism that followed. Feudalism was a very different system from the absolute ownership seen in Rome. In a feudal system, a king didn't own his land outright in the same way a Roman citizen owned their property. The land was held in a network of loyalties, not absolute ownership. Likewise, a serf wasn't the property of their lord in the way a Roman slave was. They were tied to the land, yes, but they weren't seen as things to be destroyed at will. The cold, brutal logic of Dominium was buried deep within the feudal system. But like a dormant virus, It was just waiting for the right moment to reawaken. And in the 1400s, that moment arrived. As Europe emerged from the Middle Ages and began to rediscover ancient Roman law, scholars started to look back at the Corpus Juris Civilis, the collection of Roman legal texts that had been forgotten for centuries. They dusted off the old laws and began to study them with new enthusiasm. At the heart of these rediscoveries was Dominium. The legal scholars of the Renaissance found a powerful, logical, and authoritative system in Roman law. They saw it as the perfect solution for a new age, an age that was on the brink of global exploration and conquest. It was in this climate that the sleeping dragon of Dominium was awakened once again, ready to reshape the world. But the reawakening of Dominium couldn't have come at a more convenient time. In the late 15th century, European explorers were setting out on voyages of discovery that would change the world forever. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed westward in search of a new route to Asia, and in 1497, Vasco da Gama rounded the southern tip of Africa, opening up trade routes to India. These explorers didn't just return with spices and gold. They returned with a terrible problem. How could they legally claim entire continents for their monarchs? The lands these explorers encountered were already inhabited by indigenous peoples, people who had lived on those lands for centuries. But these indigenous peoples didn't have a concept of ownership that matched the Roman idea of dominium. They didn't have fences, deeds, or a system of ownership that allowed for absolute control over the land. To the European explorers and their backers, this meant that the land wasn't really owned by anyone. It was nobody's land, terra nullius. This legal justification was twisted, but it was powerful. If the indigenous peoples didn't have the kind of ownership recognized by Roman law, if they didn't have the right to destroy, to control, and to profit from the land, then they weren't really using it. And if they weren't using it, then it could be claimed by anyone who had the power to do so. This idea wasn't just used to claim land. It was used to justify the enslavement of entire populations. Under the logic of dominium, indigenous peoples were seen as part of the landscape, not fully human, just like the trees and animals. And under the rules of dominium, things could be claimed. This legal theory, born out of ancient Roman thought, became the justification for the transatlantic slave trade, the colonization of the Americas, and the exploitation of Africa and Asia. It was the greatest theft in human history, sanitized by a 1,500-year-old legal concept that reduced human beings to property. Entire continents were taken, not by force alone, but by legal documents, all built on the logic of Roman law. If you didn't own land the way the Romans defined ownership, then you didn't own it at all. This system of thought didn't just impact a few explorers and conquerors. It redefined the very concept of ownership. It gave rise to an entirely new way of viewing land, people, and resources. Entire continents became property things to be owned, controlled, and exploited. But this new way of thinking created new problems. How could one person or even a group of people control such vast expanses of land and resources? How could they manage and exploit an entire hemisphere? As Europe expanded its empires, the need for new systems of ownership and control became clear. The risk was enormous. A single fleet of ships lost to a hurricane could bankrupt a royal family. So the rulers of Europe came up with a solution, a new kind of owner, a new kind of entity that couldn't die, couldn't be jailed, and couldn't lose more than they put in. And so in the early 1600s, the first modern corporation was born. The British East India Company, followed by the Dutch East India Company, represented a new type of ownership, one that combined all the powers of dominium but with none of the human limitations. These early corporations were granted powers that no single person could hold. They could claim territory, mint their own currency, build forts, raise armies, and wage war, all under the protection of the state. They were granted the full power of dominium, but with the added benefit of limited liability. In the next part, we'll explore how this innovation in financial thinking forever altered the course of history. In the early 1600s, a groundbreaking shift occurred in the way ownership and power were viewed. It wasn't just about land or personal property anymore. It was about something much more powerful, a new kind of ownership. This ownership wasn't tied to an individual with a physical body. It was tied to a creation, an entity that had no life or soul, a company. This wasn't just any company, but a powerful, almost mythical creation, a corporation. The British East India Company, founded in 1600, was the first of its kind. This wasn't a simple trading venture, it was a new breed of organization. Granted almost limitless power by the English crown, the company was allowed to do things that even kings could not do. It could claim territory, build forts, mint money, raise armies, and wage war. Essentially, it could act as a sovereign state, but there was a catch. This company had no human body, no soul, no consciousness. It was a legal fiction, a construct, designed purely for legal purposes. Yet it was granted the same rights as a living person in terms of power, control, and influence. The British East India Company wasn't alone. Just a few years later, the Dutch East India Company was formed in 1602, and like its British counterpart, it was granted incredible powers. These companies were not businesses in the sense that we understand today. They were something entirely new. They were treated as fictional persons under the law, granted the full power of Dominium by the state. These companies didn't just represent private enterprise. They were state-backed monopolies with the authority to control vast regions of the world. The British East India Company, for example, not only traded goods like spices, silk, and tea, but effectively ruled India. It collected taxes, maintained its own army, and made decisions about the future of the territory. The company didn't just trade in goods, it traded in power. And this was where the original idea of Dominium, the right to use, profit from, and destroy, was amplified to new extremes. But what made these companies truly different was an innovation in financial structure, limited liability. This concept would go on to revolutionize the world and continue to shape modern capitalism. Limited liability meant that investors in the company could not lose more than they had invested. So if the company failed, if its ship sank in a storm, or if its armies were defeated in battle, the investors would only lose their initial investment. Their personal wealth was protected. In other words, the risk was limited, but the potential for profit was virtually limitless. If the company made a fortune, the investors reaped the benefits. If it lost, they lost only a fraction of what they had put in. The company itself, as a legal entity, bore the brunt of any failures, not the individual investors. This system was a game changer. It meant that individuals could now invest in projects on a scale never before imagined, with the promise that they wouldn't lose everything if things went wrong. The company, this fictional entity, had become the ultimate shield, allowing people to take risks without fear of personal financial ruin. It was a brilliant innovation, but it had darker implications as well. The concept of Dominium, with its right to use, profit from, and destroy, had now been applied not just to land and slaves, but to entire countries, economies, and populations. The East India Company, for example, wasn't simply involved in trade. It was involved in the total domination of people and resources. The company controlled entire regions of India, exploiting its people, extracting wealth, and building vast fortunes in Europe, while its armies ensured that resistance was crushed. This was not just exploitation on a small scale. This was the industrial-scale extraction of resources and labor. The East India Company didn't just trade with India, it ruled India, extracting enormous wealth, enriching investors in London, and building a foundation for British imperialism. The wealth created by the company flowed back to England, where it fueled the rise of one of the largest empires in history. And this system wasn't limited to one company or one country. It was a global system of exploitation, built on the logic of Dominium and protected by the legal frameworks of European powers. The British East India Company wasn't just a corporation, it was an empire in disguise. It acted as a state, with its own army, its own laws, and its own goals. And its impact was far-reaching. It wasn't just involved in the trade of goods. It was deeply involved in the oppression and exploitation of entire populations. The company's operations in India were brutal. It used its control of the region to exploit its people, forcing them into labor, extracting vast amounts of wealth, and using the threat of military force to crush any resistance. But despite the incredible power of these early companies, there was still a crucial problem. What happened if a company failed? What if the risks it took proved too much? For most people, the risk of losing everything was too high. If a company's venture failed, the investors would lose their wealth, and the company could be bankrupted. But with limited liability, this problem was solved. Investors could back these enormous ventures with the confidence that their personal wealth would remain safe. This legal structure allowed companies to take greater risks, leading to more aggressive colonization and exploitation. Corporations like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company could now operate with virtual impunity. They could conquer land, enslave people, and extract resources with little fear of losing everything. The system of Dominium had become so powerful that it no longer just applied to slaves or land, it applied to entire countries, entire populations. But as the years went on, this system didn't just stay confined to the 17th century. It evolved. It expanded. It spread across the globe and became even more ingrained in society. The legal logic of Dominium was used to justify not only the colonization of the Americas and the exploitation of Africa and Asia, but also the creation of vast financial empires. Companies like the British East India Company laid the groundwork for the modern multinational corporations that dominate the world today. These early corporations were the foundation of the modern global economy. They were the first examples of what we now know as multinational corporations, entities that transcend national borders and operate on a global scale. These corporations are granted immense power by the state, just as the East India Company was. They are treated as legal persons with the same rights as individuals, but without the limitations of a physical body. And just as in the case of the East India Company, modern corporations are often granted privileges that no individual could ever have. They are allowed to own vast amounts of land, control vast resources, and influence entire countries. They are given the legal right to protect their interests, often through lobbying and political donations, and they are allowed to operate without the same level of accountability that individuals are held to. Modern corporations are often more powerful than governments, shaping laws and regulations to benefit their interests. The legal fiction that began with the East India Company, the concept of treating a corporation as a person with all the rights of an individual, has evolved into a powerful and often uncontrollable force. Corporations now have the right to free speech, the right to own property, the right to sue, and even the right to influence politics. But they have no body. They have no soul. They have no morality, and that's where things get truly dangerous. This legal framework of corporate power, built on the principles of Dominium, has created a world where human beings often find themselves reduced to mere resources. When you apply for a mortgage, for example, you're not seen as a person with dreams, hopes, or ambitions. You're seen as a FICO score, a debt-to-income ratio, a set of numbers that determine whether you're a good asset or a bad one. Your entire financial life is reduced to a balance sheet. Your debt, your obligations are just things on a spreadsheet that can be bought, sold, and traded. And it's not just banks that treat you like property. When you go to work, you're not seen as an individual with a unique set of skills and experiences. You're seen as human resources, one of many assets that can be used to generate profit for the company. You are an expense on a spreadsheet, nothing more. And just like the ancient idea of Dominium, the corporation has the right to use you, to profit from you, and ultimately to destroy you if necessary. A layoff, for example, is simply the exercise of the corporation's right to destroy you. When you lose your job, it's not because you've done something wrong or because you're a bad person. It's because a number on a spreadsheet says it's necessary. You're no longer a person in the eyes of the corporation. You're just a number, a line on a balance sheet, a resource to be used or discarded at will. This is the world we live in today, a world where corporate entities have more rights than individuals. The ancient concept of Dominium never truly died. It just shifted, it evolved. And now, instead of individuals owning slaves or land, corporations own everything from the resources of entire countries to the labor of millions of people. The legal system that protects the rights of these corporations is the same system that reduces human beings to property. The world we live in today is not so different from the world that existed centuries ago in ancient Rome. The concept of Dominium, the legal right to control, profit from, and even destroy, continues to be the framework through which much of our society functions. What began as a Roman legal principle governing property and human beings has evolved into the complex web of laws, systems, and corporate structures that dictate our daily lives. The legal systems we live under today, especially those governing corporations and economic systems, are still shaped by this ancient idea. Take a moment and think about your daily life. When you wake up in the morning, when you go to work, when you interact with financial institutions, you are living within the legacy of Dominium. But it isn't just about the ancient ownership of land or slaves, it's much more subtle than that. The very way our society organizes itself, the way wealth is distributed, and the way power is structured all point back to that one idea: the right to own, control, and destroy. In the modern world, corporations are the new kings. They have more power than many governments, shaping laws, economies, and entire countries. And these corporations operate under the exact same principles of Dominium that the Romans used. They are granted legal rights that were once reserved for individuals, with none of the responsibilities or consequences that come with being human. Corporations are not just businesses. They are legal fictions, entities created by the state to operate with the same rights as a person but without a physical body, conscience, or mortality. The legal fiction of the corporation was firmly established with the creation of the British East India Company in the 1600s. But today, it has evolved into something even more powerful. Corporations like Amazon, Walmart, Apple, and BlackRock are among the most influential entities in the world. They control vast resources, employ millions of people, and have the power to shape global markets and politics. Their ability to amass wealth, influence policy, and dominate entire industries has made them more powerful than many nations. In fact, these corporations often wield more power than entire governments. The key here is the concept of dominium. Just like the Roman slave owners had the right to use, profit from, and destroy, today's corporations are given the same rights. They can use their resources and workforce to generate profits. They can enjoy the fruits of that labor, and they have the legal right to destroy, whether it's by laying off workers, moving operations overseas to exploit cheaper labor, or closing down factories to increase shareholder value. These corporations are not bound by the same human limitations as individuals. They don't feel guilt, responsibility, or mortality. They only feel the bottom line. The evolution of corporate personhood is where the true power of dominium becomes most evident. In the late 19th century, a landmark case in the United States, Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad, established a principle that would reshape the landscape of corporate law forever. In this case, a brief note from a court reporter granted corporations the same rights as individual citizens under the 14th Amendment. Originally, this amendment was meant to protect the rights of freed slaves, but it was instead used to extend personhood to corporations. This decision was monumental because it effectively gave corporations the ability to act like people. They could own property, enter into contracts, sue and be sued, and most importantly, they could be granted constitutional protections. The irony is profound. The same legal protections intended for human beings, especially those who had been enslaved, were now applied to the corporations that would go on to perpetuate new forms of exploitation. This was a dramatic shift, and it paved the way for the modern corporate world as we know it today. The decision essentially established a legal framework where corporations, as fictional persons, could have the same rights as real living human beings. They could amass wealth, own land, influence politics, and crucially, avoid responsibility. A corporation cannot be jailed. A corporation cannot feel pain. A corporation cannot die. The human owners behind the corporation may be held accountable in some ways, but the corporation itself continues on, regardless of its actions. The people who run these corporations can often protect their personal wealth and assets, even when the corporation's actions cause harm to others. But here's where it gets personal. Think about your life for a moment. When you walk into a bank for a mortgage, are you seen as a person? Or are you a FICO score, a debt-to-income ratio, a number on a spreadsheet? The banking system, like every other system built on the principles of dominium, treats you as property. Your debt, your obligations are no longer part of your personal story. They're just numbers to be bought, sold, and traded. You're a good asset or a bad asset based on these numbers. Your value, your worth, is determined by your ability to pay back money. Your home is not just a place where you live, it's a thing to be used, profited from, and possibly destroyed. If you default on your mortgage, your house will be foreclosed upon. The bank, a corporation, will take possession of your home and sell it, turning it into profit. This is just another exercise of the rights granted under dominium. The bank owns your debt, and if necessary, it can destroy the thing it owns, the house. It doesn't stop there. When you go to work, you're not treated as an individual with unique talents and potential. You are treated as human resources. Think about that phrase for a moment. You are just a resource like capital, like raw materials. You're an expense on a spreadsheet, a unit of labor that can be used to generate profit for the corporation. Your life, your time, your effort, these things become commodities in the eyes of your employer. This is where the full weight of dominion plays out. The corporation has the right to use you, to profit from you, and when necessary to destroy you. This is what a layoff is. A layoff isn't a personal failure. It's the corporation exercising its legal right to destroy what it owns, your position in the company. The decision isn't made based on who you are or what you've contributed. It's made based on a set of numbers, based on the financial health of the company and the ever-present need to increase profits, and the law backs it. The law protects the corporation's right to destroy your livelihood because, ultimately, you are just another resource to be managed for profit. But the influence of corporations doesn't stop with your mortgage or your job. Today, corporations are the largest political donors in the world. Thanks to the Citizens United decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2010, corporations were granted the ability to spend unlimited amounts of money on political campaigns. This ruling, much like the one in Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad, extended the legal rights of individual citizens to corporations, giving them the power to influence elections and shape public policy. Corporations now have the ability to pour billions of dollars into lobbying efforts, political campaigns, and super PACs. This means that the laws that govern our lives are often written to benefit the richest corporations in the world, not the people who actually live under those laws. Corporations use their power and money to lobby for policies that help them grow, maximize profits, and avoid regulation. And they do this with the full support of the law. The result is a political system that is increasingly beholden to corporate interests. It's no longer about serving the needs of the people. It's about serving the needs of the corporations that control the economy. And this shift in power, this shift in the rights of corporations, is built on the same ancient idea that allowed a Roman magistrate to decide who owned what and who could be destroyed. When you look at the world today, it becomes clear that we are living in a system that is still governed by the same principles that governed ancient Rome. The concept of Dominium, the right to use, enjoy, and destroy, is still the foundation of our economy, our politics, and our society. Corporations have more power than ever before, and the individuals who run them have more wealth and influence than most entire nations. The system is built to protect their right to own, control, and destroy, while human beings like you and me are left to navigate a system that treats us as resources, not as individuals. But here's the thing, we have the power to change this system. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But if we begin to understand the history of Dominium, where it came from, how it evolved, and how it impacts us today, we can begin to challenge the systems of power that keep us under control. The world we live in today is not the only possible world. And the corporations that dominate our lives don't have to hold all the power. The future is still ours to shape. We can demand a world where human beings are valued not as resources, but as individuals with rights, dignity, and autonomy. We can create a world where corporations are held accountable for their actions and where people, not legal fictions, have the ultimate authority. It won't be easy, but it's a fight worth fighting. The story of Dominium is far from over. It's a story that continues to unfold every day in our lives. But we have the power to change the ending. It's time to rewrite the rules and create a world where people come before property, where the rights of individuals are protected, and where the power of corporations is held in check.